There's a particular kind of silence that follows a phone call nobody answers. Ethan Cole knew that silence well. 11 missed calls. 11 times the screen lit up with her name, Claire, and 11 times it faded back to black untouched. Not because she couldn't see it, because she chose not to. What do you do when the person you built your whole life around stops looking at you and starts looking backward, towards someone who broke her first? Ethan didn't shout. He didn't demand an explanation. He didn't drive to her ex's apartment and pound on the door the way some men might have. He did something far more dangerous, far quieter, and far more permanent. He put the phone down. He let the silence sit there, unanswered, unexplained. And when it rang again, not her name this time, but a stranger's number he didn't recognize, he answered. That single choice would end up changing more than he could have imagined that night. It would test what he believed about patience, about dignity, about what it actually means to stay quiet when everything in you wants to scream. This is a story of what happens when a quiet man finally stops waiting to be chosen and discovers that silence, used the wrong way, can either save you or erase you completely. Ethan Cole was 34 years old, and for 6 of those years, his life had quietly rearranged itself around one person. He lived in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, a town so unremarkable that people who left it rarely spoke of missing it. The kind of place with one main street, a diner that had been serving the same meatloaf special since 1987, and a river that ran slow and brown past the edge of downtown. Ethan had grown up 2 streets over from where he now lived, and there was something about that continuity, about never straying far from where he started, that made him feel steady in a world that seemed to reward people for constantly reinventing themselves. He worked as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of job that never made headlines but kept bridges from falling and buildings from leaning. He liked that about it. Nobody praised a bridge for standing. Nobody threw a parade because a parking garage didn't collapse under the weight of 100 cars. It simply stood unnoticed, and that quiet, invisible reliability was, to Ethan, its own kind of honor. He had built a career, and in some ways a whole philosophy of living, around the idea that the things that mattered most were rarely the things anyone applauded. Claire Bennett had walked into his life at a mutual friend's 4th of July barbecue, holding a paper plate of undercooked corn and laughing at her own joke before anyone else could catch up to it. She had flour on her sleeve from helping in the kitchen earlier, and a loud, unguarded laugh that carried across the yard and made 2 strangers turn their heads. Ethan remembered thinking, in that unglamorous, sun-bleached first moment, that he had never seen someone so unafraid of being fully herself in a room full of people she barely knew. He introduced himself clumsily, said something about the corn being underdone, and Claire had looked at him with mock offense before admitting he was right and laughing again, louder this time. It wasn't a dramatic beginning. There was no lightning, no cinematic swell of music. Just 2 people standing near a cooler of warm beer, talking for 45 minutes about nothing in particular, both of them quietly aware that something had shifted. They dated for a year and a half before Ethan proposed. Not with fireworks or a hired string quartet, but on an ordinary Tuesday evening on the same porch where, years later, everything would begin to unravel. He'd made a simple dinner, nervous the entire time, and when he finally asked, his hands were shaking so badly that Claire had to help him get the ring out of the small velvet box. They married 2 years later. Nothing extravagant. A small ceremony behind her parents' house, string lights sagging between 2 oak trees, 40 guests who ate too much cake and cried during the vows anyway. Ethan gave a short speech. He wasn't a man of many words, and he knew it about himself, but the ones he chose, he meant completely. He told Claire, in front of everyone they loved, that he didn't need grand gestures to prove what he felt, that some of the strongest things in the world were quiet, like foundations, like roots, like the steady beams that held up everything visible without ever needing to be seen themselves. Claire had cried through the whole thing. Ethan remembered that clearly, how she gripped his hands at the altar, like she was afraid the moment might slip away if she let go. For a long time, it worked, not in the loud, cinematic way people talk about love in movies, but in the quiet way that mattered more, the way that actually sustained 2 people through years of ordinary life. Sunday mornings with coffee going cold because they were too busy talking about nothing important. Long drives with no destination. Windows down. Claire's hand drumming on the dashboard to whatever song was playing. The specific, unglamorous comfort of falling asleep next to someone and not needing to perform anything. No charm, no wit, no polished version of yourself. Just two tired people breathing in the same dark room, trusting each other enough to be boring together. Ethan often thought in those early years that this was what the philosophers he quietly admired had been trying to describe all along. Not some grand, dramatic love, but a steady, undramatic devotion that asked for nothing except presence. He had read Marcus Aurelius in college, almost by accident, in a required humanities course he'd nearly dropped. Something about the Roman emperor's private, unpolished journal entries had stayed with him. The idea that true strength wasn't about controlling others or demanding recognition, but about mastering your own reactions, your own mind, regardless of what the world threw at you. Ethan had carried that idea quietly into his marriage, into his work, into every argument he chose not to have. But somewhere in the fourth year, something in Claire began to shift. Subtly at first, the way a crack forms in a foundation long before the wall above it shows any visible sign of damage. You don't see it happening. You only notice much later that something which used to feel solid now creaks slightly when you lean your full weight on it. She started mentioning a name. Daniel. Daniel had been her first love, back in college. The kind of relationship that ends messily, dramatically. The kind you tell yourself you're completely over, right up until the moment life proves otherwise. They had dated for 2 years at Ohio State, breaking up in a way that left Claire, by her own admission, a wreck for longer than I want to remember. Daniel had cheated on her during their final semester, and betrayal had cut deep enough that Claire rarely spoke of him at all in the early years of her relationship with Ethan, just a name mentioned once or twice, quickly moved past, filed away in the category of old wounds better left alone. Daniel had moved away after graduation, married someone else in his late 20s, divorced 2 years later, drifted through a handful of cities and jobs before finally moving back to Ohio for a position that, on paper, had nothing to do with Claire at all, except it did. He reached out to her first, a message that started innocently, almost apologetically, as, "Hey, small world, saw on Facebook you're still in Millbrook. Hope you're doing well," and ended months later, as long phone calls that Claire took in the other room, her voice dropping into a soft, warm register Ethan hadn't heard directed at him in a long time. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself, over and over, that a person's past didn't disappear just because they built a new life on top of it. He believed, sincerely, that trust meant not needing to interrogate every conversation his wife had with someone who used to matter to her. Ethan noticed. Of course he noticed. He wasn't naive, and he wasn't blind, whatever else people might assume about a quiet man who rarely raised his voice. But he had built his entire adult identity around being the man who didn't overreact, who trusted first and questioned only when trust had clearly, undeniably failed. He told himself it was nothing. Old friends catching up. Nostalgia, not betrayal. Two people processing an unfinished chapter from a decade ago. Nothing more. He told himself that for a long time. Longer than he should have. There was a particular evening, early on in this quiet shift, that Ethan would return to later, turning it over in his mind like a stone he couldn't quite put down. It was a Sunday in late August, the kind of humid Ohio evening, where the cicadas seemed to argue with each other from every tree on the block. Claire had come home from a girls' dinner that Ethan later learned, almost by accident, had actually included Daniel, a detail she mentioned so casually, in passing, while unloading the dishwasher, that he almost missed it entirely. "Oh, and Daniel showed up too. Small world," she'd said, not looking up from the silverware drawer. "He's still friend with Jenna, I guess. Anyway, how was your day?" Ethan remembered standing very still in the kitchen doorway, processing the sentence, waiting to see if she would say anything more about it. She didn't. She simply moved on, asking about his day, and Ethan, not wanting to seem like the kind of man who polices his wife's dinner plans, let the moment pass without comment. He thought about it for days afterward. Not because anything had happened. Nothing had, as far as he knew, but because of how easily she had folded the detail into an ordinary sentence, as though it required no more weight than mentioning what she'd eaten. He began to wonder, quietly, whether that ease was a sign of innocence, or a sign that she had already stopped considering his feelings when making these small private decisions about who she spent her evenings with. He didn't ask. He told himself it wasn't worth disturbing the peace of their home over a coincidence at a dinner she hadn't even planned. And in some sense, he was probably right. But it was the first of many small moments where Ethan chose comfort over clarity, chose the appearance of trust over the harder, more honest work of actually asking the question sitting in his chest. Suspicion doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, the way cold air finds a gap under a door. You don't notice the draft until you're already shivering, until you've been cold for so long you've forgotten what warm felt like. It started with small things, the kind of details that seem insignificant on their own, but accumulate into something undeniable when you finally allow yourself to add them up. Claire began keeping her phone face down on the counter, something she'd never done before in 6 years together. She started taking longer at the grocery store, 20 minutes stretching into an hour, a hurried explanation about running into someone she knew, or helping a co-worker with a project on evenings that used to belong entirely to them. She laughed at texts she wouldn't show him, a private smile crossing her face like a door quietly closing a room he used to be welcome in. Ethan asked her about it once, carefully, the way you'd approach an animal you didn't want to startle. Soft voice, no sudden movements, careful not to corner her into a reaction she'd resent him for later. You've been talking to Daniel a lot lately. Claire didn't flinch. That, more than anything, unsettled him. There was no guilt in her expression, no defensive stammer, just a kind of tired, matter-of-fact honesty that somehow felt worse than if she'd lied. He's just going through a rough divorce, she said, not looking up from the dishes she was drying. I'm allowed to have friends, Ethan. You've never made me feel like I couldn't. He nodded. Of course she was. He believed in that, genuinely believed it, not just as a line he told himself to avoid conflict. A marriage without trust wasn't a marriage at all, just a shared address held together by suspicion and surveillance. And Ethan had watched enough friends destroy their relationships that way to know he never wanted to become that kind of husband. So he let it go. But letting it go and forgetting it are two very different things. He carried it with him afterward, quietly, invisibly, the way he carried most things. Over the following months, the calls to Daniel grew longer, and Ethan's calls to Claire grew shorter. Not because he wanted them to, but because she started letting them ring out. Not always. Just enough. Just enough that he began keeping count without meaning to, the way you count something you're trying hard not to be counting. 3 unanswered calls became 5. 5 became 9. He never wrote the number down anywhere. He didn't need to. It lived in the back of his mind like a low, persistent hum. He never asked about Daniel again after that first conversation. He told himself silence was strength. That a man secure in himself didn't beg for reassurance, didn't chase, didn't make a scene over missed calls and quiet phones left face down on kitchen counters. He believed, deeply, that dignity meant not needing to ask twice. He had read enough Stoic philosophy to convince himself that his own peace of mind should never depend on another person's behavior, that Claire's choices belonged to her, and his job was simply to master his own reaction to them. It was, in theory, a beautiful idea. In practice, it was slowly hollowing him out. There is a difference between quiet strength and quiet erosion, and Ethan, for all his composure, hadn't yet learned to tell them apart. Strength holds its shape under pressure. Erosion simply wears away, so gradually that the person disappearing rarely notices until there's very little of them left standing. One evening in late October, cold enough that he could see his breath walking from the car to the front door, Ethan came home to find Claire sitting on the porch steps, phone pressed to her ear, laughing softly into the receiver, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders against the chill. She didn't hear the car pull in. She didn't hear the gate. He stood in the driveway for almost a full minute before she noticed him, and in that minute, he watched his wife look more alive, more lit up, talking to a voice from her past than she had looked at their dinner table in weeks. Something about the ease of her laughter, the way her whole body curled slightly forward like she was leaning into the conversation, told him more than any confession could have. She hung up quickly when she finally saw him standing there. "Just Daniel," she said, tucking the phone into her sweater pocket. Like it was nothing, like it hadn't just cost him something he couldn't yet name. Ethan said nothing. He went inside and made dinner for 2, pasta, the same recipe they'd made 100 times before, though he suspected, even then, standing at the stove with his back to the door, that only one of them still fully belonged at that table. They ate mostly in silence that night. Claire mentioned something about work, about a deadline coming up. Ethan nodded along, offered the appropriate responses, and later, lying beside her in the dark, replayed the image of her on the porch steps, laughing into the phone, over and over, until sleep finally, mercifully, took the thought away from him. Around that same time, Ethan met an old college friend, Marcus Whitfield, for lunch, the kind of catch-up meal that happens once or twice a year between people whose friendship has survived mostly out of loyalty and habit rather than active effort. Marcus had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier, and something about his easy, hard-won honesty made Ethan, uncharacteristically, open up a little about what was happening at home. "You know what my mistake was?" Marcus said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "I stayed quiet for way too long, telling myself I was being the bigger man. And by the time I finally said something, she'd already made up her mind. Silence doesn't buy you as much time as you think it does, man. Sometimes it just runs out the clock on you." Ethan had nodded, said something noncommittal, and changed the subject shortly after. But the word stayed with him longer than he wanted to admit. A warning he wasn't yet ready to fully hear, filed away in the same quiet place where he kept the porch steps, the missed dinners, the growing count of unanswered calls. The night everything changed began ordinarily enough. The kind of ordinary evening that gives no warning of what it's about to become. Ethan was working late on a bridge inspection report, the kind of tedious detail work that required total focus. Load calculations, stress points, the small invisible things that determine whether something holds or collapses under pressure it was never designed to handle. There was a strange irony in it, he'd later think, sitting in the fluorescent hum of his office long after everyone else had gone home. He spent his days making sure structures didn't fail silently, checking for hairline cracks before they became catastrophic ones. He hadn't thought, until much later, to ask the same careful questions about his own marriage. He tried calling Claire around 7, mostly out of habit, a small, ordinary check-in he'd made 1,000 times before without thinking twice about it. No answer. He assumed she was driving or in the shower or simply distracted by something at home. He tried again at 7:30, then 8, then 8:15, a small knot of unease starting to form somewhere beneath his ribs. By 9 o'clock, he had called 11 times, and 11 times the phone had rung out into nothing. No voicemail picked up, no text back, no "sorry, missed this, everything okay?" Just silence. Stacking on top of silence, each unanswered ring a little heavier than the one before it. He sat at his desk with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen like it might explain itself if he watched it long enough, willing it to light up. A colder, more honest part of him already knew what the silence meant, had known it for weeks if he was being truthful with himself. Claire wasn't unreachable. Self-service in Millbrook was fine. There were no dead zones, no excuses left to reach for. She was choosing not to be reached, and there was only one place, only one person, that kind of choosing usually led back to. He thought about driving to Daniel's apartment. He knew, roughly, which street it was on. Claire had mentioned it once, offhand, and he'd filed away without meaning to. He sat with the keys in his hand for almost 10 minutes, turning the idea over. What would he even say? What would he do? Knock on a stranger's door and demand his wife come home, like some scene out of a movie he'd always found faintly embarrassing to watch. That wasn't him. That had never been him. And some quiet, stubborn part of him still believed that showing up like that would cost him something more valuable than his pride. It would cost him a version of himself he'd spent his whole life trying to become. So he put the keys down. He sat back at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand, staring at the screen, and waited. Around 9:40, his phone buzzed. Ethan's chest tightened, hope moving faster than logic, faster than the calm he was supposedly known for. He looked at the screen, already halfway to relief. It wasn't Claire. It was an unknown number. Local area code, no name attached, no context. Under normal circumstances, on any other night, he would have let it go straight to voicemail without a second thought. He wasn't in the mood for spam calls or wrong numbers or someone trying to sell him a car warranty he didn't own. But something about the timing, about the strange, suspended stillness of that particular night, made him answer, almost against his own better judgment. "Hello?" A woman's voice, uncertain, slightly out of breath, like she'd been putting off making the call all day and had finally worked up the nerve. "Hi, I'm so sorry. This is really random. I hope it's okay that I'm calling this late. My name's Maya. I think I got your number from an old flyer for the structural inspection service. I have a retaining wall on my property that's been cracking pretty badly, and I've called 3 engineers today who didn't pick up, or picked up and then never called back. You're the first person who's actually answered." Ethan almost laughed at the strange, small mercy of it. A stranger's cracked wall reaching him on the exact night his own foundation was quietly, invisibly failing. There was something almost too poetic about it, if he'd been the kind of man who noticed such things out loud. "I can take a look," he said, his engineer's brain automatically shifting into familiar, comfortable territory of problem-solving. "Tell me what you're seeing. Horizontal cracks, vertical. Is there any bulging in the wall itself?" Maya described it as best she could, a retaining wall behind her house that had started leaning slightly over the past few months, cracks spreading in a pattern she didn't have a vocabulary to explain properly, worried it might collapse entirely before winter. Ethan listened, asked the right questions, offered a rough sense of what might be happening before he'd even seen it in person. It was a simple, professional exchange. Nothing more, but something about being needed, even for something as unremarkable as a cracked retaining wall, landed differently than it should have on a night like that one. Someone had called. Someone had needed him, specifically, urgently enough to keep trying until someone finally answered. And he had answered. They arranged for him to come out that Friday to assess the damage properly. Ethan wrote the address down on the back of an old receipt, and something about the small, mundane act of writing it down, committing to being somewhere, being useful to someone, settled a part of him that had been unsettled all evening. After the call ended, Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a long while, phone resting face up beside him, half expecting Claire's name to finally appear on the screen. It didn't. He thought briefly about calling Marcus, about repeating conversation they'd had over lunch weeks earlier, about finally admitting out loud how bad things had actually gotten. But it was late, and Marcus had his own life to tend to, and Ethan had spent so many years being the person other people called when they needed steadying that the idea of reversing that role felt almost foreign to him. Instead, he opened his laptop and pulled up the bridge inspection report he left unfinished at the office, forcing his mind back into the familiar, orderly world of load calculations and safety margins, a world where problems had clear causes, and clear causes had clear solutions, unlike the quiet, shapeless problems sitting in his own kitchen. Claire never called back that night. She came home just after 11, offering no explanation, and Ethan didn't ask for one. Ethan didn't confront Claire when she finally came home just after 11, cheeks still flushed from the October cold, offering a vague explanation about losing track of time while helping Daniel move some boxes into a storage unit across town. He didn't ask why her phone had been silent for 4 hours straight. He didn't ask why the woman standing in front of him, peeling off her coat, seemed to be performing calm rather than actually feeling it, a slightly too quick smile, a slightly too detailed account of an evening that didn't require that much explaining if it had really been as innocent as she made it sound. He simply said, "Okay," and went to bed, but something inside him had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way a support beam shifts millimeters under sustained pressure, invisible from the outside, barely perceptible even to the person standing closest to it, but catastrophic if left unaddressed long enough. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't expected. He kept in touch with Maya, the woman with the cracked retaining wall. What started as a single professional visit, assessing the damage, recommending a fix, explaining load distribution and drainage issues in his calm, unhurried way while she watched, genuinely fascinated, asking follow-up questions most clients never bother to ask, turned into something else entirely over the following weeks. Not romance. Not yet. Not really. Not in any way he could have named out loud without feeling like he was betraying something. Something quieter and more foundational than that. Maya asked him questions. Real questions. Not the polite, distracted kind that people ask out of obligation, but genuine curiosity. What made you become an engineer in the first place? Do you like the quiet of it, spending your days thinking about things nobody else notices? Do you ever get tired of holding things up that nobody ever thanks you for? Nobody had asked Ethan questions like that in years. Not questions about him, specifically about what moved him, what he thought about when he was alone with his own mind. Somewhere in the drift of his marriage, he had become a fixture in Claire's life. Reliable, present, assumed, like furniture you stop noticing because it's always exactly where you left it. Not seen. Not really. He told himself it was nothing. Just conversation. Just someone genuinely curious about a man who had quietly stopped being curious about himself, who had stopped asking what he needed because he'd spent so many years focused on what everyone else needed from him. There was an afternoon, a few weeks into the wall repair project, when Maya asked him to stay for lunch after he'd finished for the day. It was a small, ordinary gesture. Sandwiches on the back porch, nothing more. But Ethan found himself lingering longer than the job required, talking about things he rarely talked about with anyone, including Claire. He told her about his father, a quiet man himself, who had taught Ethan that the measure of a man wasn't in how loudly he spoke, but in how steadily he showed up. He told her about the bridge he'd inspected during his first year on the job, how proud he'd felt watching cars cross it without a single thought for the engineer who'd made sure it would hold. Maya listened the way Claire used to listen, back in the earliest years of their marriage, before Daniel's name started appearing in ordinary sentences. It wasn't performative listening, the kind people do while waiting for their turn to speak. It was full attention, unhurried, the kind that made Ethan feel, for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, like his thoughts were worth someone else's time. Meanwhile, at home, the distance between him and Claire widened into something neither of them named out loud, though both of them clearly felt it. She spent more evenings on the porch, phone pressed at her ear, her voice dropping to that same soft register whenever he happened to walk past. He spent more evenings staying late at the office, or driving out to check on a project that had less and less to do with load-bearing walls, and more to do with the strange, uncomplicated relief of being somewhere he felt genuinely welcome. He wasn't chasing Maya. That was a strange, uncomfortable truth he had to sit with during the long, quiet drives home from a property, radio off, just his own thoughts for company. He was simply no longer chasing Claire. Hadn't been for months, if he was honest with himself. And in the space that silence created, someone else had quietly stepped forward and asked, without ever explicitly asking, to be let in. One night, lying awake beside a wife who felt more like a roommate observing the terms of a shared lease than a partner, Ethan finally understood something Seneca had written centuries earlier, though he couldn't yet fully name it. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. He had spent months imagining Claire's slow retreat, dreading it, rehearsing conversations in his head that he never once had the courage to actually start out loud. And in the meantime, he had let real connection, patient, curious, quietly attentive, pass right by him unacknowledged, simply because it hadn't announced itself the way he'd always expected love, or even friendship, to announce itself. He thought, more than once during those weeks, about ending things with Claire outright. He thought about telling her everything in one long, unbroken confession. The 11 calls, the stranger who answered when his own wife wouldn't, the strange, guilty comfort he'd found in being asked real questions again after so long feeling invisible in his own home. But the strong don't announce their pain, he told himself. They carry it quietly, with dignity, until it either heals on its own or breaks them open completely. Ethan chose, again and again, to carry it a little longer. He told himself this was patience. He told himself this was a discipline he'd always admired in the philosophy he'd carried quietly since college. He didn't yet understand that he had crossed some invisible line between patience and avoidance, and that the two, from a distance, can look almost identical. There was one afternoon, a few weeks into this quiet, parallel life, when Ethan sat alone in his car outside, Maya's property, engine off, hand still on the wheel, and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for months. What exactly am I waiting for? He didn't have a clean answer. He wasn't waiting for Claire to end things. Some part of him still hoped, stubbornly, that she wouldn't. He wasn't waiting for proof of anything. He already had more than enough evidence to justify a hard conversation, if he'd wanted one. If he was honest with himself, sitting there in the cooling car, he was waiting for permission, some external sign that would finally make it acceptable for him to say out loud what he already knew in private. He was waiting to be released from the role he'd assigned himself. The calm one, the patient one, the man who never made things harder than they needed to be. He thought of a line from Epictetus he'd underlined years ago in a second-hand paperback. Something about how it isn't events that disturb people, but their judgments about events. He had judged his own silence as noble for so long that he'd stopped examining whether it still served him, or whether it quietly become a kind of self-erasure dressed up in philosophical language. He sat with that discomfort for a long moment before finally starting the engine and driving home, no closer to a decision, but little closer, at least, to being honest about the question itself. The turning point came on a Tuesday, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of day nobody expects to reorganize the rest of their life around. Ethan had gone to Maya's property to finish the retaining wall repair, the job nearly done after several weekends of steady work. It was cold, the sky low and gray, the first hard frost of the season settling over the grass, the kind of afternoon that made everything feel a little more honest than usual, stripped of any softness or pretense. As he worked, laying the last course of stone, Maya brought him coffee and sat on the porch steps nearby, watching him with the same quiet attentiveness Claire used to have years ago, before Daniel's name became a fixture in their house, before phones started living face down on counters. "Can I ask you something?" Maya said, wrapping both hands around her mug. "That night I called you, the first time, you sounded relieved, like you needed someone to need you more than you needed the wall fixed." Ethan paused, trowel in hand, the cold air sharp in his lungs. He hadn't expected to be seen that clearly by someone who, in the grand scheme of things, barely knew him. He set the trowel down slowly. "My wife wasn't answering her phone that night," he admitted, the words coming out plainer than he'd intended. 11 times. I called 11 times, and she never picked up once." Maya didn't say anything right away. She simply nodded, the way people do when they already understand more than they're saying out loud, giving him space to continue if he wanted to, or to stop there if that was easier. "I'm not going to be the reason you leave your marriage," she said finally, her voice careful, deliberate. "I want to be really clear about that, Ethan, but I think you already know that phone calls aren't the real problem here. The real problem is you've been quiet for so long, about so much, that you've forgotten quiet and invisible aren't the same thing. You keep mistaking disappearing for strength." Her words settled into him slowly, the way real truth often does. Not as a sudden lightning strike, but as something that had clearly been sitting just under the surface for a long time, patiently waiting for someone to finally name out loud. He drove home that evening with a strange, unfamiliar clarity he hadn't felt in months, maybe longer. He wasn't angry at Claire. Not really. He wasn't even angry at Daniel. Whatever role the man had played in all of this, he was, for the first time and longer than he cared to admit, brutally honest with himself. He had built his entire identity, his entire sense of self-worth, around being the calm one, the steady one, the man who never needed to raise his voice or ask twice for what he needed, and somewhere along the way, quietly, without him ever noticing the exact moment it happened, that discipline had curdled into something else entirely. Not strength, disappearance. He decided, driving past the same bridges he'd spent years inspecting for exactly this kind of slow, invisible failure, that he would talk to Claire tonight. Really talk. Not perform the calm he'd been performing for months. Not accuse her. Not demand anything from her. Just tell her the truth. Plainly. The way he should have told her months ago, back when the first crack had appeared and he'd chosen, deliberately, to look away from it. He pulled into the driveway slower than usual that evening, sitting for a moment with the engine off, rehearsing what he might say, the way he used to rehearse presentations before a big client meeting. He thought about starting with the 11 calls. He thought about starting with Maya. He thought about starting with something softer. "I think we've been quiet with each other for too long," before deciding that whatever he said first mattered less than simply choosing, finally, to say something at all. But when he got home, Claire was already sitting at the kitchen table, coat still on, and the moment he saw her face, pale, tight around the eyes, he knew something had shifted on her end too, that whatever conversation was about to happen had already been building on both sides of the house. "I need to tell you something," she said, before he could even get his own words out. Daniel asked me to leave with him. Last week, he's moving to Colorado for a new job, and he asked me to come with him. Ethan's chest tightened, bracing for the words he'd been quietly dreading for months, the confirmation of everything he'd suspected and never once said out loud. I said no, Claire continued, her voice breaking slightly on the word, her hands gripping her coffee mug like it was the only steady thing left in the room. Not because I don't still care about him. Some part of me probably always will, and I'm not going to lie to you and pretend otherwise. But because sitting in my car outside his apartment, about to say yes, about to actually get in the car and drive away with him, all I could think about was you. Not guilt. You, specifically. How you never once made me feel small, for still having feelings I couldn't fully explain or control. How you never yelled, never accused me, never once made me choose between you and my own confusion, even when I clearly deserved to be confronted. You just waited, Ethan. You just kept waiting. And sitting in that car, I finally realized I'd been mistaking your patience for indifference this whole time, when really, it was the single most respectful thing anyone has ever given me. Here was a twist Ethan never saw coming. Not a betrayal finally confirmed and out in the open, but a choice quietly made in his favor, by a woman who had spent months testing the edges of a door she wasn't even sure until that moment in the car, whether she actually wanted to walk through. But the deeper twist, the one that reframed everything that had come before it, was this. Ethan realized, sitting across from her, that his silence hadn't earned him this outcome by pure accident. It had given Claire the room to find her own way back, on her own terms, without pressure, without ultimatum, without a man demanding her loyalty as proof of his own worth. His quiet hadn't been weakness, not entirely. It had been, in its own imperfect way, the exact thing that made an honest, freely chosen return possible. And yet, sitting across from his wife, hearing her choose him, watching her hand shake slightly around her mug, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected to feel in that moment. He thought of Maya, of being asked real questions again after so long, of being genuinely seen, not just tolerated, not just assumed. He understood, sitting there in the kitchen that had witnessed so much unspoken tension over the past year, that Claire's returning didn't erase what he'd learned about himself during her absence, that he, too, deserved to be someone's answered call, not just someone's eventual, hard-won choice. He told Claire the truth that night, about Maya, about the retaining wall, about the strange, guilty comfort he'd found in being needed by a complete stranger while his own wife let the phone ring out 11 times without picking up once. Not to punish her, not to trade pain for pain in some petty transaction of hurt, but because a marriage built on unspoken silence, even patient, well-intentioned silence, was still, ultimately, a marriage built on sand. Claire cried when he told her, not from betrayal. Ethan had done nothing wrong, and she knew it immediately, could hear it in the careful, honest way he explained it. But from the quiet, aching grief of realizing how close she had come to losing something steady and real while chasing something achingly familiar instead. They didn't fix everything that night. Some things aren't fixed in a single conversation, however honest. But they started being genuinely honest with each other, really honest, without performance, without careful management of the other person's feelings. For the first time in over a year, and that, Ethan would come to understand in the weeks and months that followed, was worth infinitely more than any performance of calm he'd carefully maintained for so long. In the months that followed, Ethan and Claire began, slowly and imperfectly, to rebuild something more honest than what they'd had before. It wasn't seamless. There were nights when old resentments surfaced without warning, when Claire admitted she still sometimes thought about the life she might have had in Colorado, and nights when Ethan struggled to explain, without sounding accusatory, how deeply her silence had cost him. But for the first time, they were having those conversations out loud, instead of quietly filing them away for later. They started small. A standing rule that phone stayed off the table during dinner, not as a punishment, but as a shared agreement to actually look at each other again. A weekly walk along the river that ran past downtown. No destination, no agenda, just the two of them talking through whatever needed talking through that week. Claire began seeing a therapist on her own, working through the unfinished grief of her relationship with Daniel that she'd never fully processed the first time around. Ethan, for his part, began writing in a journal each night, a habit borrowed loosely from the philosophers he admired, a place to name what he felt before it had a chance to quietly calcify into another kind of silence. It wasn't a perfect ending, and Ethan never pretended it was. Some evenings still carried the faint residue of everything that had almost happened. But there was an honesty between them now that hadn't existed before, a willingness, hard won on both sides, to say the uncomfortable thing rather than let it sit unspoken until it grew into something neither of them could name. Ethan never saw Maya again in any romantic sense, though he thought of her sometimes, of the retaining wall now holding steady against the hillside, and the quiet, uncomfortable truth she had handed him on that cold Tuesday afternoon. He was grateful to her, in a complicated way he never fully explained to Claire, for teaching him the difference between being patient and being invisible, a lesson he suspected he would carry with him far longer than the marriage he'd almost lost while learning it. He did, eventually, send Maya a short message months later, simply thanking her, not for anything specific, just for the honesty she'd offered a stranger who happened to be fixing her wall at exactly the moment he needed to hear it. She never replied at length, just a brief, warm note wishing him well. Ethan understood, reading it, that some people pass through your life for exactly as long as you need them, and no longer, and that there was a kind of grace in letting that be enough. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that we should waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be, and simply be one. Ethan hadn't been trying to be good for anyone's approval, hadn't been performing his patience for an audience. He had simply believed deeply and sincerely that strength meant silence, that a man who truly trusted himself didn't need to demand attention, didn't need to chase, didn't need to beg to be chosen by someone he loved. That belief was not wrong, but it was incomplete. There is a real, meaningful difference between the silence of discipline and the silence of disappearance. The first protects your peace while you wait, with genuine patience, for truth to reveal itself in its own time. The second erases you slowly, invisibly, until people around you, and eventually even you yourself, forget you were ever fully present in the room at all. The strong do stay quiet. That much is true and worth holding on to. But quiet is not the same as invisible, and the line between them is thinner and more dangerous than most people realize until they've already crossed it. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events themselves, but from the meaning we assign to those events. And Ethan had assigned his own silence a noble, philosophical meaning for so long that he nearly forgot to ask the harder question underneath it, whether that silence was actually protecting his peace or simply allowing him to vanish from his own life without ever having to risk the discomfort of open conflict. Seneca reminds us that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of the time we're given. And Ethan very nearly wasted months of his one life waiting patiently for someone else to notice that he had already, quietly, begun disappearing from his own marriage. If there's one thing to carry away from Ethan's story, let it be this. Patience is a genuine virtue only when it is consciously chosen, over and over, not when it slowly becomes a convenient substitute for the harder courage of actually speaking your truth out loud. Stay calm, stay steady, hold your composure, especially when everything in you wants to break it. But never, ever let your quiet become the reason no one, not even you, remembers that you are still standing there, in the room, waiting to finally be seen. Consider, too, what it cost Claire to finally say what she said at that kitchen table. Not because her honesty was rare, but because it required her to admit out loud that she had mistaken someone's steadiness for a lack of feeling. How many of us have made that same mistake? In reverse, assuming that a quiet partner, a quiet friend, a quiet parent simply doesn't feel things as deeply, when in fact they're only choosing moment by moment not to perform what they feel. The Stoics were never asking us to feel less. They were asking us to master the space between feeling and reacting, and that space, if we're not careful, can quietly become a place where we disappear entirely, unnoticed even by ourselves. The strong stay quiet, but the wise know exactly when quiet has finished doing its work, and understand that it is, finally, time to speak. If this story moves something in you, take a moment to sit with it before you scroll away, and think honestly about your own silences, which ones are protecting you, and which ones might quietly be erasing you. Ask yourself, too, who in your life might be mistaking your quiet for indifference, when really it has always been something closer to love. And if you like more stories like this one, quiet, honest, built around a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself but earns its weight slowly, consider subscribing. It helps more than you know, and it costs you nothing but a moment's pause.